Heavy clashes in Damascus continue when the Syrian Freedom Army shoots down a helicopter belonging to the regime in Qabun. 85 killed in Syria today until this moment, and the regime forces target Idlib and Aleppo suburbs. After his talks with Putin, Annan hopes for the Security Council to reach a consensus about Syria. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The Syrian Human Rights Network said that the death toll in Syria reached today 85 victims until this moment. 36 of them fell in Damascus and its suburbs. Meanwhile, violent clashes erupted between the Syrian Freedom Army and the Syrian Army in a Saba Bahrat yard at the heart of the capital, Damascus, as the Syrian Freedom Army has a new strategic military operations in the capital under the name of the Volcano of the Revolution in support of Homs and Al-Midan, while bombing was renewed this morning from the regime's helicopters on several neighborhoods in Damascus, including Al-Midan, Al-Tadamun, Al-Qabun, Harasta, Berze, Al-Hajr Al-Aswad, and Al-Qadam. The countryside of Damascus was also targeted by military operations as the cities of Al-Quswa, Al-Mu'addamiyya, and Spani witnessed huge explosions in light of the continued shelling from the regime's helicopters.
الدول العربية متآمرين.
3 consecutive days during which the Syrian capital has gone through what it never had gone through before. The revolution matured in it as the Assad forces invade it, while the world is watching. This is the Maidan neighborhood. It's the neighborhood that rebelled against the regime after decades of its uprising against the French occupation. Most of the homes of the neighborhood are destroyed. Tanks stormed the neighborhood amid fierce fighting that is almost turning into a war that the rebels are calling the Damascus volcano or the capital's earthquake. This neighborhood witnessed heavy shelling and attacks by warplanes, and huge explosions could be heard in the Corniche. The neighborhood of Nahar Aisha was exposed to military operations as well, while the Jober neighborhood was invaded from several directions after the arrival of military reinforcements, which later carried out a widespread military campaign of raids and searches and destruction of homes. Heavy shelling also focused today on the neighborhood of Al-Qabun, followed by the sound of several explosions and plumes of smoke rising in the Karaj area. In the meantime, the violence continued in Al-Tadamun neighborhood, amid conflicting reports about the Syrian Freedom Army being able to control the stockpiles of weapons of the regime. And the case is similar in the rest of the capital. But the historic identity of Damascus in resisting the occupation may prove victory, particularly as the fighting reached the neighborhood of Abu Ramman al-Dimashqi, which shows that the regime is beginning to lose control on most of the cities, including the capital.
And to know more about the updates in Damascus and its suburbs, with us on the phone, Susan Ahmad, the spokeswoman for the Revolutionary Command Council. Susan, good afternoon, good evening. And first of all, I want to ask you, heavy shelling on the neighborhood of Al-Midan today and explosions also with huge clashes occurred today. What's the situation now in Al-Midan?
Good evening. Actually, Al-Midan today is under fire. Helicopters are shelling, tanks are shelling, armored vehicles and tanks are bombing the streets of Al-Midan. Buildings are, people are trying to run away. Unfortunately, it is really dangerous to try to leave your home because the snipers are everywhere and they are shooting badly at any moving thing.
Yes. Susan, can you hear me? It seems that we have lost our connection with Susan. I want to thank her for being with us. And moving on to the rest of our news, where the Joint Command of the Syrian Freedom Army, or the Office of the Coordination, and all military councils in all cities and provinces declared the start of the Volcano of Revolution in Damascus to support Homs and all the troubled cities. The statement asked the Syrians to perform tasks as a strategic first step in terms of tactics to get to the country into a civil disobedience. 12 victims fell today in Homs and its suburbs in a time where the neighborhoods in the cities of Al-Khalidiyya, Jurat al-Shiyah and Tilbisi witnessed heavy artillery shelling and mortar fire. Meanwhile, violent explosions shook Al-Insha'at neighborhood after heavy fire from machine guns, while several victims were wounded in Al-Hula as a result of the heavy shelling by the regime forces stationed in the village of Al-Ghur. And violent clashes erupted today between the regime's army and the Syrian Freedom Army in the neighborhood of Al-Qassara, while the regime forces continue their military operations in the city of Al-Wastan and the village of Al-Buwaida. Meanwhile, Al-Hamza brigades, that is part of the Syrian Freedom Army, used for the first time military tanks in the city of Al-Wastan in Homs, targeting security barrier for the regime forces in response to the Trimsey massacre and other massacres committed by the regime forces. Meanwhile, the Syrian Freedom Army reported that its military operations resulted in direct losses for the regime forces and the acquisition of weapons.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
The bombardment continues on Homs and its suburbs by the regime forces, which is using different kinds of heavy weapons to demolish the city. More about Homs updates we see in the following report.
The bombing continues on Homs and its suburbs, where the northern part of the city witnessed the heaviest portion of the bombardment.
Allahu Akbar, Talbisi.
Al-Wastan, Talbisi, Ghanto and many other areas witnessed heavy bombing that was characterized as the heaviest since the revolution, since the regime forces used its military planes, artillery and rocket launchers, which led to killing many civilians, including children and women, in addition to destroying many houses. The bombing reached the town of Al-Qusair, Qal'at al-Hasn, Talkalakh and others. Meanwhile, the city of Tadmor was not excluded from the bombardment, but also targeted the areas that were used by citizens as a shelter to prevent being killed by the regime. The towns of Al-Buwaida, along with its surrounding areas, were subjected to bombardment, arrest and robbing campaigns by the Shabiha forces. The besiegement is still ongoing on Homs, as well as the constant bombardment on Jurat al-Shiyah, Qarabis, Khalidiyya, Qusur, as well as in many other areas. Jobar, Sultaniya, Baba Amr, Khalidiyya and Al-Bayada are living under heavy bombardment, in addition to the mortar shelling that caused the burning and destruction of many houses and farms. From their side, the Syrian Freedom Army announced that they attacked the regime forces in their camps and caused severe damages in their military equipments after carrying out several operations. The Syrian Freedom Army's new tactic involves intensifying its shelling on the regime's army from the places where they have full control over. This tactic has proved to cause more damages to the regime's army and confusing it.
And moving on to the province of Idlib, where activists announced the death of at least 9 victims today, while several were wounded after continued heavy shelling on Idlib and its suburbs, where the shelling and the random shootings continue on Kansafra town in Idlib. Meanwhile, the town of Mhambil is under heavy shelling and clashes that took place between the regime's army and the Syrian Freedom Army since the early morning. To that, the city of Ma'arat al-Nu'man witnessed heavy fire from Al-Dalla barrier in Al-Masakin neighborhood. And moving on to Daraa province, where the towns of Nahita, Tafas and Da'al witnessed heavy artillery shelling, with mortars and activists said that snipers are shooting indiscriminately at passers-by in Dar al-Balad, which led to the death of a victim, while many were wounded. Meanwhile, the area of Jbab witnessed a campaign of random arrests and raids amid intensive gunfire. In the meantime, activists broadcasted images of many agricultural crops that were burned by the regime forces in the town of Tal Shab.
قامت إصابات الهجان الحدودية بحرق المحاصيل الزراعية وحرق.
And coming up later in the bulletin, the number of Syrian refugees is on a constant rise. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. Several reports stated that the regime's army are shelling the villages of Harb Nafso and Talaf in Hama suburbs, where several civilians were wounded by shrapnel from missiles, and two villages witnessed the displacement of their citizens in the neighboring villages. Meanwhile, heavy artillery shelling rocked the villages of Sahl al-Ghab in Hama, and activists reported that the regime forces committed yesterday a new massacre in the neighborhood of Hamidiyya, which led to the deaths of several victims. And according to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, 5 activists were executed in a Mujamma al-Tibbi, which became a military barracks in the city of Hama.
Over 50 people were killed in Hama and its suburbs as the regime forces carried out public prosecutions and intensified its military campaigns on the city. The neighborhood of Al-Hamidiyya witnessed the heaviest shelling, bombing, destruction, and even the biggest number of victims that were killed. This came in conjunction with the sound of heavy explosions and gunfire in the neighborhood of Al-Munakh, near the medical center, in addition to the neighborhoods of Al-Qusur, Jarajma, Aleppo Road, and the area of Al-Hadr. These violations came along with the massive number of military forces spreading in the towns, supported by tanks, artillery and anti-air missiles, where many of the towns were surrounded and invaded by the Shabiha forces, who robbed many houses and burned them, leading to the killing of an entire family that consisted of a woman and 4 of her children. The security and the Shabiha forces also arrested many citizens in the neighborhood near the medical center and tortured them. In Al-Fayha neighborhood, a B&B vehicle entered the city and launched a mortar shell on worshippers that were exiting a mosque, which led to injuring many citizens, some of which are in a critical condition. Al-Asa Square and many roads were closed to stop the cars from entering and passing by the cities. This comes along the spread of Shabiha forces on the roads as they carried out robbing campaigns where they destroyed shops and looted its contents. This operation was carried out as the snipers of the regime were targeting any human that moves on the road. The Syrian Freedom Army retaliated these violations of the regime and its Shabiha forces as the two armies were undergoing heavy clashes in the blocked areas of the regime. Heavy clashes also occurred in the neighborhood of Al-Nasr, near a farm where explosions and gunfire were heard. The suburbs of Hama, and despite the besiegement and the bombardment, took to the streets in anti-government protests in Al-Latamina, Kafrsita and Salmiya. The situation was not different in the neighborhoods of Jarajma and Sheikh Ambar, where the people took to the streets in protest that demanded freedom and the overthrow of the regime.
New documents released by WikiLeaks showed emails revealing that Asma al-Assad spent more than $440,000 buying furniture from one of the shops in the luxurious Chelsea area in London for the renovated summer presidential palace near Latakia. Daily Mail newspaper published new details about Asma al-Assad correspondence and revealed that she bought luxurious furniture 4 months ago while thousands of Syrians die every day. At least 3 victims were killed today due to the ongoing military operations on Al-Sakhur and Al-Sha'ar districts in Aleppo, where strong explosions were heard and heavy clashes took place between the regime forces and the Syrian Freedom Army. The coordinations of the Syrian Revolution reported that the Syrian Freedom Army managed to take control on one of the tanks which tried to attack Hamdan town, whereas heavy shelling continued until Rifat for 5 days, and witnesses saw that the regime's forces used missiles in shelling the city from an infantry school. Meanwhile, many demonstrations took place today in Aleppo's districts supporting Damascus and the areas of Al-Mashhad, Al-Kallasa, Bustan al-Qasr, Al-Sha'ar districts. condemning al-Assad's regime and calling for his overthrow. The regime's violations continue to kill innocent civilians in Syria, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network. More about these violations we see in the following report.
الشهيد عبد الودود مروان نابلسي سقط أثر قذيفة هاون.
The regime forces see no difference between a child, a woman, and a senior when shelling with heavy missiles and violating the Syrian cities and neighborhoods. As the reports on the regime's perpetrations increase, the Syrian Human Rights Network and the Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies say that the regime's widespread military barriers have become the center of arbitrary arrests and sniping, making the civilians vulnerable to risking their lives when simply walking in the streets. The regime forces continue to use warplanes to shower civilians with missiles in Hama, Aleppo suburbs, Homs, Daraa, and Idlib, most recently causing the horrific massacre in El Tremse in Hama. The regime forces now target areas with high population density, such as districts of Homs and newly in the neighborhood of Al-Tadamun in Damascus, resulting in staggering numbers of civilian death tolls. This is also the case in other cities of Syria, to the extent that activists report their inability to dig up civilian corpses from underneath the debris of homes demolished by regime forces shelling. They have also reported the regime's prohibition of both the Red Cross and Red Crescent from entering to do their duties of rescuing civilians from underneath building ruins. Furthermore, the displacement of families from their hometowns has become a daily routine in most of Syria due to the regime forces terrorizing military operations on the many afflicted Syrian neighborhoods, of course with these displaced families attempting to live on minimal necessities of life. However, the greatest violation committed by the Assad regime forces is definitely the continuously dreadful shelling on districts who have placed their will in God alone, still witnessing the barbarism of the regime and their use of international illegal weaponry to massacre their very own people.
Politically, the UN Security Council is voting tomorrow for a draft resolution supported by the West, which threatens the Syrian regime that there will be more sanctions if it does not stop using heavy weapons. Mark Lyle Grant, the British ambassador in the United Nations, said that after another session of talks, Russia and China objected on Chapter 7 without presenting any reasons, adding that the UN Security Council should decide the fate of the UN mission before the end of its mandate on Friday. The Kremlin announced today that the meeting between the Russian president and the special envoy Kofi Annan in Moscow proves that Russia actually supports Annan's peace plan, which aims to solve the Syrian crisis. Meanwhile, Annan yesterday met with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov without any statements after the meeting. And coming up in the bulletin, the number of Syrian refugees is in a constant rise. The United Nations clarified that the number of Syrian refugees who sought its help since April has almost tripled to reach up to 11,200 refugees. And according to the UNRWA, women and children made up 3/4 of the Syrian refugees who were registered in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. The agency spokesman, Adrian Edwards, said in a statement today that in Geneva that the real figure is much higher, and almost a lot of Syrian refugees totally depend on humanitarian aid. He also reported that at least 40,000 Syrians sought refuge in Turkey, while Jordan has seen influx of 33,400 Syrian refugees, and almost 30,900 arrived in Lebanon, while more than 7,900 are seeking asylum in Iraq. Meanwhile, the number of refugees fleeing from the oppression and massacres in the Syrian regime are rising, with an estimated 750 refugees per day who flee to the neighboring countries. But they are not faced with any less severe conditions than those experienced inside Syria.
700 refugees is the average number of Syrians who cross every day to the neighboring countries, including Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, after the escalating violence in their towns and villages due to the siege and constant shelling by the forces of the regime. But their conditions outside the borders are not better.
We have been here for almost a month and a half, and if it weren't for God's grace and the man who owns this land and gave us shelter, we left when they shelled our town, and this is our life now, from bad to worse.
And according to international organizations, 75% of the refugees are women and children, who are suffering a shortage of food and medicine in all the refugee camps, particularly in Lebanon, after the decision to stop treating the injured refugees in hospitals. The suffering is also the same in Jordan, where the British Foreign Secretary William Hague has taken a tour around the camps. The reality of the situation there has driven the British Foreign Minister to call for rapid movement of the Security Council under Chapter 7.
It is what we have come to know from news reports, from reports coming out of Syria. The sheer barbarity and criminality of the Assad regime is fully on display when you listen to the people here.
In terms of the flow of aid, Hague said at a news conference with the Jordanian Foreign Minister Nasser Joudeh that more than 17 billion sterling pounds were allocated to provide food for 80,000 people, and the aid will continue to increase. The foreign minister noted that the number of refugees in Jordan amounted to 137,000 refugees. These figures were supported by the UN Refugees Agency, that the number of refugees has tripled since April, bringing the number to 112,000 refugees, according to the agency spokesman Adrienne Edwards, who said that the real figure is much higher, and many of the Syrian refugees rely entirely on humanitarian aid. The Turkish Directorate of Disaster Management and Emergency has also shown that Turkey currently hosts 38,914 refugees distributed over its territory. This is the case in the refugee camps. Within the Syrian borders, however, the regime is adopting the policy of a dense block to prevent aid from reaching to about 850,000 people in need in Syria, according to the operations director at the Center for Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs of the United Nations, John King.
So, in the joint press conference with the Jordanian counterpart, Nasser Joudeh in Jordan, the British Foreign Minister Secretary William Hague stressed the need for a political solution to the crisis in Syria, pointing to the need for a strong and clear decision from the United Nations. And Hague emphasized the need to impose sanctions on those who refuse to implement an announced plan under Chapter 7. For his part, the Jordanian Foreign Minister Nasser Joudeh confirmed that they are currently searching for a consensus in the Syrian file, away from the disputes within the international community. And regarding the refugees, Joudeh stressed that the Jordanian government will not cooperate with any failure for the security threat, and it does not prevent Syrians from entering Jordan, but they will be thoroughly searched. And before we end our bulletin, we remind you of our main stories. Heavy clashes in Damascus continue, and the Syrian Freedom Army shoots down a helicopter belonging to the regime in Al-Qabun. "85 killed in Syria today until this moment, and the regime forces target Idlib and Aleppo suburbs." After his talks with Putin, Annan hopes for the Security Council to reach a consensus about Syria. And with this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.